So I've got a friend of mine coming back today, and we're going to talk about personal projects and how they might help you grow as a photographer. Let's go behind the shot. Hi, welcome to Behind the Shot. I'm Steve Brazill. This is the show where we try and get inside the mind of great photographers by taking a closer look behind their shots from conception to completion and all the stories and challenges that happen in between. And once again, this is going to be a different kind of a show today, and I'll explain that kind of as we go through, but I am excited to have my friend back, Los Angeles-based portrait, sports, commercial photographer, Mr. Ian Spanier. How are you?
Good. How are you, Steve? Good to see you again.
It's good to see you again, too. Last time I saw you was at probably at CBU when you were doing a presentation, California Baptist University in Riverside. And you were supposed to be there recently, and that got canceled. You had some kind of a gig. You're doing a lot of work lately, and you're doing stuff for B&H and stuff, right?
Yeah. So this year started off horribly. As you know, Hollywood's been a little bit rough this year. So, one of the things which apropos goes into what we're going to talk about today is the good bad aspect of my entire career, which is that I've never just been one thing. Primarily, I am a portrait photographer, but I've always had a hand in some other areas, and because of that, it's allowed me to continue to work in other areas when one maybe drops off unexpectedly, when there's a writer's strike and nobody expects it, and then a pending production strike right behind it that doesn't happen, but still screws up everything in Hollywood. And so this year started off very much so with me on the road every other week working on this specific project. And that kind of carried through until about June. And then I sort of had a bleak outlook for this year and a little scared of where things were going, especially compared to last year, which was a nice year, a very good year. And then things sort of picked up in August and late July, maybe. And once that happened, things just kind of kept rolling. And I mentioned to you previously that all of a sudden, some of the appearances that I don't normally do as many of throughout the year just piled all in the fall. And they took place of the assignment work that I normally would be doing that has sort of dwindled away a little bit this year. So fortunately, it allowed me to keep moving, which I think as we get on in our careers is super important to understand about the, up and down of the career and how that works and how you need some patience in those slow times. And I always have personal work going on in the background in some form or fashion. And that is probably one of the most important elements to continue to work. So even if I am not getting paid to do a job, I'm doing personal work, you're going to see that on my social media feed because I'm continuing to put out work. I'm continuing to push myself as a photographer. I'm continuing to come up with what I like to call more tricks in my bag as solutions for the different challenges that I face on the variety of photography assignments that I get.
Well, and it's true. I mean, we are freelancers and we are subject to the whims of the market. You brought up Hollywood. We've discussed your background on this show. You've been on the show multiple times before, and we've kind of discussed your background. But yeah, as a portrait photographer, you do a lot of work with, Hollywood stars and well-known athletes and things like that. So when there's a lack of work in Hollywood and they don't need PR pictures, obviously that's going to affect you. You were first on the show in 2019. I looked these up because I wasn't sure of the dates. Classic portraits and classic lighting. We did the Jeff Bridges shot that I still think is one of my favorite portraits that you've ever done. Then you were back on in 2022. We talked about some of your favorite lighting setups, which again, I should mention you're a Westcott pro. So when it comes to lighting, you know what you're talking about. But then also the stuff, a lot of the stuff when you say, other things that you don't normally do as much of are coming back, you've done the educational side for a long time. You used to do a lot of stuff down at the Canon Learning Center in Costa Mesa. You do these workshops for Christopher Kern over at Cal Baptist University, great photography program there. You're doing stuff for the B&H event space and their YouTube channel and stuff like that. But this one, this thing we're going to talk about today, and again, I'll explain it to those of you that don't know yet what I'm talking about if you didn't see the YouTube poster or something. I'll explain kind of this as we go through. But this is one of those projects that kind of struck me as the thing I should do, and I don't. And I think more photographers should do. Real quick before we get into the topic, let me just remind everybody, I've got a blog post associated with every show that I do. If you head over to the website, behindtheshot.tv, find this episode, you'll find a blog post I wrote about Ian. All the links that we talk about today are in there. Links to the book that we're going to talk about are in there. The book is actually key to this personal project that we're going to be doing. And again, I'm at stevebrazill.com. If you just want to follow my work for some reason or another, I'm on Instagram, X, Mastodon, Blue Sky. All of those are at Steve Brazill for me, or for the podcast, it's at Behind the Shot TV if you find those anywhere. And then last but not least, if you're watching on YouTube, I do get comments periodically that, look, I don't like the interview. I don't want to watch an interview. You said we're going to talk about, subject this, and I just want to get right to the subject. It's a podcast first and foremost. I always kind of follow the same kind of structure. Get to know the person so that you know why you need to listen to them or should listen to them. They're not a random person on the street. They've got credibility, and here's their, kind of CV, as it were. But on YouTube, I do have timestamps, chapter markers down in the description. So as you pass by and hit that like and subscribe button, head down to leave a comment or whatever, all the chapter markers are down there. Jump around, go to whatever subject interests you. That's absolutely fine with me. So this topic that we're going to talk about, you and I were talking. You got a new book coming out, which we're going to get into in a minute here. You've got a new book coming out. Who's the author with it? You do the pictures, and who's the author?
Yeah, there's a guy called Aaron Sigmund.
Okay, Aaron Sigmund. And we're talking about the book. The book, by the way, so that everybody knows, is called Cigars, a Biography. And as we were talking about this book, you said something to me in an email that really struck me, right? That made me think to myself, I'll say what it is in a second, but it made me think to myself, that would be a great show. This book, first of all, am I correct? This is your fourth book?
It's my fourth book. This is my third on cigars.
So, okay, that begs questions. First book, by the way, was Playboy, A Guide to Cigars, 2009.
Yeah.
Then you had Local Heroes, America's Volunteer Firefighters. That was 2012. And then another cigar book, Arturo Fuente. And now you've got this one, which again is on cigars. But what you said to me in the email that made me think to myself, we need to dive into that more from a purely photographer point of view, is how a long-term personal project helps one grow as a photographer. There's a lot in that sentence, right? I've done shows on personal projects before. I've always been fascinated, actually, by some of the personal projects that photographers take on. But in this particular book, I want to understand why this project. Like you told me this is 17 years of your work. What is your fascination with this topic or cigars, or why did this whatever it is, hook you to be so in depth in it for so long?
The funny answer to that is it's not. It's cigars are not a passion of mine. This is something I fell into. I never intended to be a guy who shot cigars. It just so happened I worked for a media company in New York during the period of 2005 to 2009. As we very quickly grew as a media company, we went from 2 magazines to 5 magazines. One of the magazines that they brought in was a launch of a brand new subject matter, that being called The Cigar Report, with writer and publisher Aaron Sigmund. That's when we first met.
Okay, there's the connection.
Now, my job at the media company, I had convinced them to hire me. My past, not everybody does, but my past was I was a photo editor in magazines for about 13 years, working uh, at the beginning at GQ magazine, and then Esquire, ESPN, and pretty much every major magazine in New York at one point or another, with the exception of maybe Rolling Stone and Time. And the variety of magazines that I worked at was putting me in a position where I was known as a photo editor for a long time in New York. But I always took pictures on the side, never intending to be a photographer. And then ultimately, I got to a place where more and more I was being asked to be the photographer. And I was actually getting tired of hiring photographers who wouldn't understand the voice of the magazine. And it was just easier for me to do the shoots. At that time, it wasn't very popular for photo editors to also be photographers. So at that point, I actually moved to LA. I worked for Muscle and Fitness out here. And then my hope was it would take, 2 or 3 years and people in New York would forget about me. It took all of 2 weeks. Everybody in New York forgot about me very quickly. But a friend of mine was working at this media company in New York and had asked me to come back to New York and work as the photo editor underneath him. He was the creative director. And I said, well, I have an idea. I don't want to be a photo editor anymore. However, I know how to run the budget. I can show you based on the model of how Life magazine worked back in the day, where photo editors were photographers, and some days they'd sit at the desk and some days they'd be out in the field shooting assignments. And I said, I can do something like that in a modern way, run your budget, make sure that we save money by having a staff photographer, and this will work really well. He sold it to the president of the company. As I mentioned, we went from 2 magazines to 5 magazines very quickly and grew. I had 2 staff photographers underneath myself. We had a 3-person department. We shot everything from still life to portrait to travel to fashion, everything that encompassed the 5 different magazines that were part of this media company. So when Aaron Sigmund came on with the Cigar Report, we had obviously never met before. And here he is getting assigned a chief photographer. And I could see in his face he wasn't really a believer in the idea that this is something that works as a model. But I assured him that I've been doing this a long time. I come from this background of photo editing. So I have a different approach to the way that I see magazines than most photographers do, because I'm already on the inside. Very first shoot that we did together, we were like, yep, okay, we get each other. And then right away, we took our first traveling assignment to the Dominican Republic to cover, I gotta say, probably like 8 or 10 factories in one very quick trip. And immediately, Aaron and I just synced, and we understood each other as far as what his role is, what my role is. And he used to actually affectionately call me Ronin, because he saw me as this sort of like secret, sort of ninja style photographer who would just sort of sneak off and just go shoot a bunch of stuff. And then he would end up with this portfolio of images for the variety of articles that we were doing for the magazine. And again, these are all luxury space titles. So the variety within those magazines went from high-end watches, high-end liqueur, fashion cigars, these expensive cigars and the brands. But within that, going and photographing the factories and the fields and the people behind the process of making a cigar, which again, I knew nothing about at that time. But that's sort of what I think worked in this whole thing. And it's because I take a view of this, not from a place of passion, but like a child who's looking at something new and just soaks it all in. So at that time, it was all new. Fast forward 17 years, I've been doing this quite a while. I know what to expect, what's going on at the factory and what's happening in the field. And, there's always subtle changes. Things always shift a little bit. But in that time frame, the sophistication of growth really took place from the stuff I was doing with Aaron directly to then some of my clients who ended up being cigar companies who manufacture these cigars and creating advertising imagery for them as well. And part of the challenge that happens quite often, which goes into some of the images that we're going to look at, is being in a place for sometimes 24 hours and making it look like I've spent a month there documenting the process. That's something that developed over time to some degree, but in another degree, I was just thrown right into the fire. To answer your bigger question of how this all kind of came about, when Aaron and I were working on the Arturo Fuente book, which was published by Asaline Publisher, we were sitting, I think, at dinner one night, and he said, "Do you realize that you have been doing this for like 16 years with me? And in that time, you have had access to more cigar world than probably any other photographer in the world." And I was like, no, I never thought about it. It's just another assignment. And
Right.
this is part of my problem in that
It's the gig,
I have such,
right?
yeah, I have such tunnel vision about the job. And I often talk about, my mentor, Harry Benson, always saying it's about the job. It's about the job. It's about the job. Of course, it sounds better with a Scottish accent, but, at the end of the day, I've never been great at stepping outside of the assignment and saying, wow, this is pretty cool what I'm doing right now. I don't think like that. I'm like, what's the job? Get it done, get it done, get it done. So Aaron said this to me and it sort of stuck in my head. And then he said, that's our next book. And so we let that lie for a moment. And then we finished up the project for Fuente and very quickly went into this. And we went back to 2007 when I started shooting. I went through, I think, 15 or 18,000 images to find out what I had shot over this period of time and what I hadn't shot. And based on that, we determined what I needed to go shoot to add into this project and complete it. And so he has, on his side, 35 years of working in the cigar industry. My 17. At one point, when I went back to the Dominican for another shoot, there was a picture on the wall of one of the main guys in the cigar world. And on that were drawings of the, I think, 17 major players in the cigar world. Out of all of them, I've shot I think 11, which is crazy.
Wow.
Some aren't living anymore. And so that really was that was what Aaron told me. You've done something over this course of time that there probably isn't anybody else that has done this. So it was sort of a no-brainer that we'd go into this.
There's a couple things that you just said though, that again, strike me. One, that you didn't approach it as a quote unquote fan of cigars. You were almost like a child that didn't know anything. And I kind of like that idea. I think most people I don't know if they go into or end up in personal projects because, I do X for a living, but Y is my passion, and they dive into photographing that passion. I think that's great. You already know the subject matter. That's handy. But there's also something unique and refreshing about photographing, going into that project, knowing nothing about it, discovering it, and letting that discovery come through the photos that you do. That Arturo Fuente book, when I was looking that one up, I can't remember the price now. I wish I'd written it down. That was a coffee table book that was
It's expensive.
yeah, it was stupid money. Like it was crazy amount of money. But that's where this type of a project leads to. If before we get into the pictures, if people do want to, find this book, this is the website, and it's Sig Culture. And you told me earlier, but so that people remember it, why is Sig S-I-G and not C-I-G?
I mean, it's just a funny coincidence, I think. I mean, he's been around cigars his whole life. His father was a cigar smoker. So I think he told me he was definitely in high school when he enjoyed his first cigar with his dad, I think, something like that. His last name is Sigmund, S-I-G-M-O-N-D. And so just a funny coincidence that everybody calls him Sig, S-I-G. And cigars is a big part of his life. And now it's not the only part of his life. He is what I term as an expert on all vices, be it, all those subject matters I mentioned were part of the cigar report, cigars, watches, cars, fashion and liquor, and he's, well versed in all of it. He's got, I think, 50 books under his belt at this point. So he's been around many different areas that all sort of intertwine with each other in one form or fashion. Wine and cigars being very similar to each other in that it's all about the taste and all that. And I think
Right.
you're a bourbon or a whiskey guy. I think that
Whiskey, yeah.
that's part of that world as well. So yeah.
And I don't smoke cigars, but I have a couple of great whiskey cigar blends. So I started this out by referring to you as a portrait sports commercial photographer. And you do a lot of celebrity portraiture, gym type portraiture. And to me, at least, one of the things that makes you so successful at that, there is a handful of photographers, professional photographers that I know, who I would say truly understand light. A lot of people use light, they use it well, they make great pictures. But then there are those people who I almost think it's I almost just think it's natural to them, where they just get it. Like they see light, they understand how to recreate it or create what they want. It's not, let's try this, right? That's kind of how I see you. But when I was going through the pictures for this book, how many pictures are in this book, by the way? Do you know?
Yeah.
There's a lot.
So there is. I believe it's 174 photographs
Okay.
by me. The book
And some
itself
historic
is,
stuff too.
yeah, there's a lot of historical images. There are some images provided to us from, whether it be people that no longer are living and there was no opportunity for me to photograph, or historical images, or there was, which I still, nudge Sig about this one. He wouldn't send me to Lebanon. I was totally willing to go. I don't have the fear factor problem, but he's always concerned about me. It's kind of funny, and I joke with him about it quite often because I'll come back from a lot of these trips. I'll do solo, and I'll come back from these trips, and he's always like, the next day, like, you didn't tell me you got home okay, and I'm just like, are you kidding me? Like, I'm too old for that shit. My parents don't even know what I'm doing, and you're worried about me. But yeah, he didn't send me to Lebanon, unfortunately, and I did not get to go to Dubai, unfortunately. So there's the two areas where I had to get images provided to us. The creative director is a woman named Liliana Guia, and she worked with those agencies to get those other images supplied. There was also some great illustrations in the book as well.
It's a big book. Like
Yes.
it's pretty awesome. I've seen a PDF of it. I don't have the normal book, but I've seen a PDF of it. But there's some pictures when I went through the book, and I'm like, let's talk about a couple of pictures and kind of look at how they affected you as this project goes. And what I was struck by was I've known you for a number of years and I know what you shoot, and there's shots in there that off the top of my head, I would say that's not Ian's genre. And then there's shots that completely fit into your genre. So let's start with this one. This is environmental portrait, guy sitting at a bar with a cigar, bartender behind the bar. It looks like a very nice, high-end, type bar. Tell me about this shot.
Sure. So that's our esteemed author, Aaron, sitting at the bar with the cigar. And this is Eugene Aretsky, who is the manager, owner, operator of Aretsky's Platoon, which is a restaurant and cigar lounge and bar in New York City, obviously frequented quite a bit by Aaron. So when one of the trips that we did was New York City, and in New York, we photographed Aaron with his tailor, who's the guy who makes all his suits and everything, who's quite involved with the book as well. We photographed Aaron with Eugene at the bar, and we photographed him with the owner and president of Bell and Ross Watches, also at this same location. So I needed two completely different looks. I don't know if you recall the image in the book, but that one I approached from a very different perspective. Now, the one thing I will point out to you is that the entire theme of this book was two pieces. I kept hammering this with Aaron over and over and over again, because what I had, I knew what I had. And that there, in a lot of cases, there's no recreating what I had
Right.
because either locations don't exist anymore, the cigar company might be gone, or you just can't necessarily recreate something that was just a decisive moment, if you want to use that term, as opposed to, the rolling process, which is very repeatable. And the whole process in general, it's very predictable now that I know the process from seed to final package. But I kept saying to Aaron, everything we do with these new shoots, which encompassed, essentially 2023 and 2024, the word is epic. We need epic images over and over and over again. I kept saying this to him, and every time I failed to provide epic, I certainly kicked myself in the face. But I kept saying to him, "That's not epic. We need to do something else. This isn't
Hold on.
epic."
I'm sorry. I have to interrupt you. I have to interject here. Two questions, and then we'll pick back up.
Mhm.
Why epic? And how do you define epic?
So epic became the term because what I learned from working on Fuente was quite often I'm there too short of a time. There's not enough time to get what we want truly, right? To get the
Right.
sense or the feel of a place or the true emotion that takes place in a certain environment, particularly with Fuente, because Fuente is a very thought-provoking company.
Okay.
There's a lot of tradition there. There's a lot of feeling and emotions tied to everything, and there's a lot of thought by their president of everything they do. They're very colorful, to say the least. A lot of factories are just cinder block walls and not a lot of excitement. Whereas Fuente, it's a I mean, if you're ever in the Dominican and can take a tour of the Fuente factory, I highly recommend it. It's beautiful, right? It's a museum to the Fuente family. And so one thing I sort of learned from that experience was, as much as I'll push, sometimes it's just not possible, getting the true vibe of a place. Sometimes I'm there when nobody's working because it's off schedule or this was when they could accommodate our time. These things are something I would try to anticipate before going, but Cuba, for example, when I went back to Cuba for this project, there was gas shortage. I couldn't get a vehicle to get us to the fields and the factories that we wanted to go to outside of town, and that presented quite a challenge in itself. So when I came up with this idea of epicness with everything, it was really so that it would satisfy those situations where something that could be just an image now has to be elevated, right? So it's not just checking a box and saying, okay, we've got Sig at Aretsky's platoon. Boom, done. Check the box. It's over. No, it has to be something that is timeless. It has to be something that will stand out as an image that will represent this in a bigger way, not just checking the box and saying, okay, we have a cigar from Fuente. Done.
Right.
Okay.
Okay. That makes sense.
So now the other piece of that was with all of the portraits that I did, the approach to the portraits was that they were portraits, not photographs. And I told this same thing to every single person that I did a portrait with. I said to them, this is not a photograph. So this is something that needs to stand out as a portrait of you or you and your family or whatever the story was, so that it felt like something more than just a photograph. And I hope that makes sense because
Yeah, it
I'll
makes
give you an
total sense to
example
me.
of it. Yeah.
It's
In
not
Ivor
capturing a
City,
moment, it's making a statement.
by capturing a moment.
Right. Yeah,
In a
exactly.
sense.
There's
Yeah.
there's a
Yeah.
weird circular thing going there. But when you look at this shot, first of all,
Mhm.
what do you know your exposure and stuff for this?
Yeah. So this was a tricky one because I was traveling to New York very light. I didn't have an assistant, didn't have a lot of equipment. So I essentially had two lights with me. I had a Westcott FJ 200, which is a small travel friendly portable strobe. And I had the FJ 80, which is sort of like one step up from a small flash. Now, the reason I
Okay.
went so minimal was because nothing we were doing was going to require a lot of lights. I was told, famous last words, but I wanted to have something. Now, I didn't have stands with me really either. I had one stand, I had my tripod, and then I had a couple of, various clamps and, little accessories like tether tools, magic arm, and things like that that I could utilize if I could. So I actually have some pictures of this. I wish I had a full BTS, but it was, again, I was working solo. But the light behind Sig, off to camera right,
Doing
is
the rim light on the back of his head.
exactly. I believe that is the FJ 200 banged into a wall for that sort of warmth, right? So I didn't have any
Okay.
gels with me. So this was a cheat of making a warm glow behind him to sort of warm up the image a little bit. In the front is a 24-inch umbrella that I actually helped develop with Westcott. I think you and I talked about this before.
Yep.
I wanted a travel-friendly umbrella modifier that I could put diffusion in front of and still do great portraits with something that's like basically what you stick in the side of a backpack. And so I had actually, this might be reversed. The FJ80 is probably against the wall, and the FJ200 I had on a clamp with a magic arm attached to the bar, firing down the bar with that 24-inch umbrella with diffusion on it. That's our key light.
Where'd you get the warmth from? It looks like window light.
Yes. So the umbrella is a silver interior with white diffusion. So that is sort of my style, which is a little bit of pop with some softness to it, right? That's kind of my
Right.
style. So that's the cleanness of that direct key light going from the camera left here.
Okay. So not doing what you do. This is coming from me, remember.
Sure.
But the way that lights the both of them, making it look like it's this much larger uniform light that's spreading the distance between the guy behind the bar and the guy in front of the bar, and then still having rim light which hits the back of Sig's head. Love that. So posing wise, did you tell them to sit like this, or they went for it and you
No,
just shot them?
this is what I was talking about in terms of creating epic moments that don't actually happen, right? So the concept was Aaron Adderetsky's platoon. That's it. We didn't have anything more than that. And he is, in part creative director, for all this stuff. And so we kind of came up with this idea. Oh, it might be fun for Eugene to be serving you your favorite drink. I scouted around and I found I liked this bar the best, right? So if you notice that light coming from the left is a little bit of a hard source,
Right.
okay? Because it's small, right? Just like the sun, when it's very far away, it's going to be a harder source. So it's a small source, and I would love to have had it closer to be bigger and softer, but I had to spread it out, and this was the best way to spread it out. If I brought it too close, it would cut off too much, and I needed it to spill back to the bar behind Eugene. If you notice, there's light back there.
Oh yeah.
Now, the rim light, I'm intentionally scraping along the wall, which is at the other side of the bar, which is a wooden wall, and that is spilling intentionally onto that brick behind Sig so that there's some depth to this image, right? This is where all the lighting stuff that you were talking about before comes into play. It's what we see with our eyes to some degree, but it doesn't get translated in a camera because of the lens and the way the camera sees it and so on and so forth. So at ISO 1600, which is how I shot this, I was able to pull in some of the room light. There was that because you can smoke cigars there, it's actually an open deck to the left of me, but it was quite cold. So we had, I think there was plastic sheeting on the window, so that means it's diffused a little bit there. So that 1600 ISO, you're going to get a little bit of natural light coming in, but really the light is coming from my strobe there. I'm overpowering in a sense. And then it's 1/60th of a second, so only a little bit ambient is coming in, and that's f7.1. Now I'm pushing that depth of field so that I can get the two of them in focus.
What do you know the focal length on this?
Um, I let me see if it's here actually.
You don't have to know. I'm just thinking
Yeah.
F7-1 to me seems, except for the fact that he's behind the bar, but you're off angle. So they're not, if you were shooting more camera right, Sid would be much closer to you than him, but you're kind of off angle. So I totally see the 7-1 working. So here's the real question that I got to ask though.
Yeah.
If, if you were to sum up in a sentence, how did this shot in this project help you grow as a photographer?
This is where the versatility of having less is more. I don't think I could make this image in 2008. And the
Oh,
reason I say that is that I didn't have the failures that taught me how to use light like this, and how maybe I would have just lit it with one light because that's all I had, and lit it from the left because that's how, you do that, right? But not knowing, maybe sophistication wise, that a rim light's really going to make this image have more depth. And by just that second light being controlled by me, puts me in a position to create an image that has a lot of depth to it. I would argue that it's not a flat image. It has some 3D aspects to it. And that's sort of something that I strive for in a lot of my work, to not be constrained by a two-dimensional surface. So images I often will make have some depth to it so that it has something of a pop to you as the viewer.
your use of the camera right light with the rim light, with the lighting up that wall, that is what adds 3D to that one. Now, this black and white shot,
Yeah.
compositionally, I love this. The way the words, the index are in there, the way you frame the doorway, the way that they're both looking straight down the barrel of the lens. I love that. Shot like this. First of all, what was your exposure data? Because people are going to want to know.
I find it funny when people want to know exposure. I don't know why.
I used to think that, but I have so many people that come to me, and I understand it. They want a baseline. Like if they're just truly learning light or just learning photography, giving them a baseline at least lets them know, okay, in a scenario like this, I might be able to get away with this, and it gives them a starting point. But anyway, what was your exposure?
Okay. Well, my argument to that is always, it doesn't matter what the focal length was. It doesn't matter what the shutter speed was, because it's always going to be a different thing when you go out to take this image. What I'd rather you learn is to wait.
Go ahead. You finish first.
I'd rather you learn to train your brain to think in f-stops. And that is how I approach most of my shoots. That I have my sweet spot, and most of my lenses is f7.1. So you'll see a lot of my stuff is shot at f7.1, including this one. However, my approach, which you'll see in one of the later images, is often from a place of visualizing what the f-stop will result in and how will that create more depth to my image. And so I'm using that brain sort of training to make that determination when I go in. So anyway,
Counterpoint.
That's my thought.
Counterpoint. Yes. I love this. Counterpoint. And I agree with everything that you said. But the counterpoint to that is, it's amazing what you can, especially if it's not your genre, it's amazing what you can learn about photography, a genre, or yourself by reverse engineering somebody else's picture. So if I don't do portraits and I shoot, moose on an open field for a living, Moose Peterson, yes, I'm thinking of you. If I'm a landscape or critter photographer and I'm interested in portrait photography or artificial lighting or whatever the case might be, reverse engineering somebody else's shot can help me better understand conversion of what I already know. It can help me better understand how to get my feet wet. And I will find out quickly, and I think any real photographer knows, I just recreated Ian's settings exactly and it didn't come out the same. Well, there's a million variables, but at least it got you to pull your camera out and play.
I do understand that. I would argue back that when I was photo editing, I would quite often push my photographers who, let's say they were a portrait photographer, I would assign them to do a food shot, because I wanted them to take the food portrait, if you want to put it that way, and basically photograph the food the way they would a portrait. And I do that quite often. So a lot of the times where I get an assignment where it's not necessarily my, quote unquote bag, I might approach it from the perspective of how would I do this if I was shooting something I shoot all the time. And that's where you start to create your own style. And the
Oh,
problem for
okay.
me, yeah,
But
the
doesn't
problem for
that
me with
also
photographers, yeah,
go ahead? Go ahead.
I was going to say the problem for me when photographers just recreate what everybody else does, because I did that for a long time. Michael O'Neill, I loved that guy's work. So I just said, okay, stick subject in a shadow, light them through the shadow. That's how you do it every time. Boom, boom, boom. Nice blue sky every time. Boom, boom, boom. Every time. It worked, but then I was just another guy who did the same thing that 17,000 other people do. I would much rather, which again goes to why when I said I typically use silver interior for my modifiers with some diffusion in front of it because it fits my look. It matches the style. Something somebody said to me a few years ago, being somebody that photographs so many different subject matters over time, people want to stick you in a box, right? But those who get me understand that whether it's a still life or a portrait, there's a line that you can draw, and it's the line that you thankfully drew, which was that I understand light. And because I understand light, it doesn't matter. And I say this all the time to people when I'm showing my portfolio. You could have a cup of coffee in front of me or Jeff Bridges. I'm still lighting it to tell the story of the day. And at the end of the day, that is what I'm here to do. And light will push that story. And because I know how to utilize light and react to light in order to psychologically get the story across, that's how I'm going to do it.
Totally love that. Agree with all of it. Here's a counterpoint, and it's not a debate counterpoint. It's simply,
Of course.
it's an added data point is a better way to word it. And that is, at the same time, let's take a scenario, hypothetical. Sorry, folks, rat hole here. I had to do it. But this to me is what makes photography fun, right? So counterpoint is, let's say that you are a world-class portrait photographer and everybody loves what you do, but as part of your personal project, you just want to, what can I do different? I want to experiment. And just like you say, if you were out shooting a deer in a field or a coffee cup on a table, there's still the way you shoot a portrait is the way you shoot, and you're going to light that cigar and brandy snifter the same way you would light a portrait because that's how you work. If at the same time you understood how Andrew Scrivani shoots or Freddie Clark shoots beverages, right? If you reverse engineer one of Freddie Clark's images, it doesn't mean that you are going to copy him, but it may mean that you're going to take somebody else's style or genre of creativity, not the subject, but how they create, and you might apply it, and you may
Okay,
not.
so
But
so
having that tool
honestly,
set,
what you're saying is exactly what this image is. So it's actually a perfect way to put it. This is inspired by Arthur Elgort. And if you
there
think
you go.
about it, right? All I was looking at, because I typically will find my inspiration from the masters of photography. I like a lot of contemporary photographers, but I don't look at contemporary photographers as much as I look at masters of photography. So you take an Arthur Elgort and you look at what he did, and that was my approach to this before I even got to Australia on boots on the ground. I had already had this in my head that this is the kind of portrait. I had it sketched out on a napkin, and I showed it to my subject here, and she's like, I love it. And it said everything it needed to say about their relationship. I had no idea about this part, but how they work together, sort of this strong woman and strong man, running this very clean and unique cigar shop, the only one in Australia really that does this sort of high-end level cigar work. And so it had to be black and white. It had to be
Timeless.
outside in front of the store. Again, aiming towards epic, not saying this is just a picture of the two people that run the shop standing with each other with their arms over each other, smiling at camera. That's not the kind of photography I want to do.
As you're framing this, because again, the framing in this is what I really love. Like this is one of those shots where composition matters. Where it's cropped, you didn't crop into the wall, you cropped just a little bit below the where the wall meets the ground. Key to me, the amount that you have above the doorway, where they're positioned, frame within a frame against the glass. I do see a reflection in the glass. I am curious, were you aware of that when you were shooting? Did that bother you? Did you want the reflection? Was that part of your story to show that that was not just a dark hole behind them? I'm curious what you were thinking.
Unavoidable is probably the better way to put it. Glass doors being the front of the shop.
You
We
were
did
aware
look
of it though, right? I know you. You knew.
well, I'm removed from the middle. So
Okay. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
I tried to hide myself as best as possible, but for that, for the direction I was going, it was impossible. We did look at bringing the grate down as an option, but quite honestly, I liked the depth of the black behind them, and I darkened it quite a bit so you couldn't see the shops across the street from it. Um, I mean, the funny thing is this, they were sort of looking at me funny because the interior of this shop is quite beautiful, and one would think we would just shoot inside the shop because it's so gorgeous. And I did do some images inside there, but not with them. Primarily, I knew this was the shot with them. And again, once I showed the sketch, it was based off of it was another Hollywood image that I had seen where a woman was lighting a man's cigarette. And I showed that plus the sketch of the arm coming across, and they liked it, and that was it. So it wasn't a hard
7-1.
sell.
7-1.
Yeah,
What else?
1/320th of a second, so that helped with cutting the glare down a bit on the glass. And then ISO 200. It actually was drizzling as we took this picture. It was beautiful weather the whole time I was there, except for the moment we stepped outside.
Love this shot. Love this shot. Now, this is one of the ones I would say people would underestimate how difficult it is to show a hand palm up at the camera, holding an object, and make it look natural and not, what's the word? Posed weird. Because most people, when they hold something out, they don't hold it normal. You've got the choice of, which way would you have the ashes go? If you held it, a lot of people would, I think, put this with the ashes away from the person, which is not how you would smoke it. But top down, people would think that might be a good composition, but this is better because it feels like they brought the cigar down. So what was your thought process taking this one?
None of that. I mean, this is the beauty of photography, in that I always talk about how I hate describing an image to some degree, because it's for you to decide what this image represents and what it makes you feel. And
Right.
I've done my job if you feel something, right? If you pause and look at it for more than a second, I've done my job. So there's always, in my mind, a danger to explaining an image, and images that are successful shouldn't need an explanation. But this is where, and this is an old image. This, I think, was 2008 or 2009. I was in Honduras. Julio Roya, who is the president of the cigar company, was in a plane accident. I don't know if you've ever been to Honduras, but there is one airport there that has an extremely short runway and is known for planes going off the runway. And he happened to be in one that went off the runway. Obviously survived the crash, but he is in a wheelchair or motorized scooter. So he was actually seated in his motorized scooter as we were moving around the factory with him. And there's a portrait of him in the book as well. They gave a full page because he has such a cool face. I mean, just like 1950s all the way. But this was a unique thing I'd never seen before at that time, which was only 2 years in. But I'd been to a lot of factories at that point, and I never saw somebody doing this, which is part of the tasting process that he does, which is to wrap this blended cigar, a new cigar that they were trying out, with an actual leaf to taste if he wanted to add this leaf to the blend. And for those who don't know, cigars are blended, meaning that there are anywhere from, I think, three or more different style or type of leaves put together inside the cigar. So unlike cigarettes, where it's just tobacco, one flavor of tobacco, there's different flavors in cigars, which is how you get the different tastes of cigars in part. And again, 17 years, I'm still not an expert on this stuff, but from what I've seen and understand, that's sort of how it is. So he was doing this thing I'd never seen before, and this is how he held it. And part of being a photographer, um, not just a portrait photographer or whatever, is, I have these other experiences in time of doing day in the life or reportage stories, things like that. And it's paying attention to details and little things that might stand out. And that aspect I was talking about earlier of being a child that's just absorbing what's going on around him. This was just interesting to me, the way that he held this particular cigar. And more than anything, it was the cigar. I'd never seen one wrapped in a leaf like that.
Right.
So I just asked him to pause for a second, and we were by a doorway. So that's just natural light coming from the right. And I said, can you just hold the cigar there for a moment, in my crappy broken Spanish and his broken English. So that's just me holding camera straight overhead and shooting down, and that's it. So there's not a ton going on. It's natural. It's not, this is just instinctual. It's not sitting there and tightly composing and contemplating this or contemplating that. In an ideal world, I probably wouldn't see his pant leg, right?
Right.
But if I didn't talk about the pant leg, somebody might not even see the pant leg or know about the pant leg. Again, the danger of talking about an image is that. But it certainly would be cleaner if there was no pant leg in my book.
Here's what's funny about that. I like the pant leg. And, I could see somebody, using now, generative fill and removing the pant leg. I don't think you need to, because then it would literally just be a hand in a cigar. And this adds the environmental side. It's depth of field wise enough out of the way that you don't notice it, but it also adds a background subject other than just, a floor or something like that. I actually like it, but that shot now is wholly different than this. Like, this is cover of a magazine shot. And my buddy Freddie Clark does this type of thing for a living brilliantly. I understand, don't misunderstand me. I know you can shoot anything. I've known you long enough to know you can shoot anything. But complexity-wise, photographing beverages and smoke and reflections and glass can be a difficult thing, especially when you're using artificial light. So, assuming that it's artificial light. Tell me about this one.
Well, it's worse than you described. This is actually shot in the basement of Aaron's then home in Michigan, with I think it was -2 degrees outside when I was in there. And essentially what happened was Aaron was living in Michigan at the time when we started working on some of these things. And he had so much vintage cigar stuff that he was not willing to ship it. There was really no other choice but me to go physically there and shoot there. And again, minimal equipment, unideal situation. The basement was the choice because there was no windows to factor in per se, but there was a door off in the distance, but that really was minimal. And one of those small basement windows with the grate was the only other thing there. But in an ideal world, I prefer the page of the Albert Watson mentality of taking all the light away, right? But I just didn't have the materials to do that. So if I had some V-flats with me, or if I had some, black velvet or enough stands that I could just drape and create a black space, that's what I would have done. I did travel with black velvet, which is what the background is here.
Okay.
And so I had clamped that onto the rafter in the basement. So that's my background stand right there. I had the FJ 80, I think, was my only light source here, and a reflector. And that's how I lit it. Cutting across, as you can see from the cigar, in order to get the the light behind the smoke a little bit. Um,
Hold on. So
Minimizing,
the
yeah,
FJ80 is camera left,
camera left, yeah.
lighting up the
You can look
cigar,
by looking at the
and
cigar, you can see that.
yeah, and then putting a little bit of light on the glass and lighting up the smoke. So the reflection in the right side of the glass is the reflector.
Yeah, so you're seeing parts of the garage, or sorry, the basement. I keep calling it a garage. Parts of the basement. The other thing I had with me was a an LED light, but it was only adding just a little bit of sort of fill in this case. I actually think, if I remember correctly, I took a piece of paper from Aaron's printer, pointed the LED up towards the ceiling, and scooped the paper so that it would reflect some light down, so that it would put a little bit of the light into, because that's a vintage mirror that everything is poised on. And that would open up the cigar a little bit so you can see the light on top of the cigar. That's where that's coming from.
So before you did that, you didn't have as much
Yeah.
reflection. You couldn't see as much reflection.
Yeah, it was pretty dark. Because we were
How'd
in a
you keep the
basement.
table so dark?
That's the so when I started that career as a photo editor, the first 2 weeks I was at GQ, and I was like, no, I'm a photo editor. I'm not a photographer. I'm better at looking at pictures and arranging the photo shoots than I am at taking them. So this is what I'm going to do. Uh, there was a book review that changed last minute, and this is pre-digital, and we didn't have time to assign the book to be rephotographed. And so I volunteered to take it home. I tell this story quite often, but I had a small speed light, and I had a tripod, and I had a camera and a cable release, and that's all I had. No other equipment. Didn't even have a light stand. So I bought a piece of white paper. I scooped it. The books were always shot the same, with a shadow of about this amount of depth from the book. So I put the book onto the standing up on the paper, and I put the camera on a tripod with the cable release, and I held the flash in my hand, and I popped the flash, like when you look at the sun and it makes spots in your eyes. So I did that looking at the white paper so I could see how long the shadow was going to be, because I didn't even have a modeling light on this speed light. So it was the only way I could tell where that shadow was falling. So I'd move my hand forward or back in order to get the shadow in the right spot. Cable released the camera, fired the flash, got my shadow correct. That started off with me being the guy that took care of the still life. So 6.5 years later, I was shooting still life for all the magazines I worked at. In that time period, I got a little savvy with some of the tricks that, similar to what you were talking about before with, dissecting other photographers' work. How can I do this? And as I always talk about, I love to fail. So I would try a lot of things. One of those things was being super creative. If I shoot an athletic shoe on a mirror, it'd be kind of cool to get that reflection of the sole of the shoe underneath, right? But how can I do that where you don't see anything behind it and there's no reflection behind it? Oh, well, if I bring black velvet, which eats up light, and I put it up against the back of the mirror, then that's going to reflect black into the mirror, which means my light will focus only on the shoe, and I'll get my reflection, and the mirror will be unnoticeable, and you'll just look at this sort of magical reflection. So that was an old trick that I had done many times with still life that I had done. And so when I got to this situation, I knew if I put that black velvet behind there, it would reflect the black from the angle that I set the camera.
So you just described what we were talking about before perfectly. And that was, you would dissect other people's shots, take that as a baseline, and then get creative with it. That's exactly what I was talking about. I love this shot. And you know what? Okay, before I do this, compositionally here, what were you thinking?
So the trick here was the smoke. That was really the hardest thing. So this was representing the pairings of cigars and I think it's brandy. I'm not great with liquor either. I've shot them all, but I couldn't tell you what one is next to the other. So Aaron is actually standing camera right and blowing smoke in to the cigar so that it would go into the bowl and wrap around. Now, working with smoke, I've done quite a bit with it at this point, obviously, but smoke is tough. It's not hard to light, it's hard to control. So you have to again pay attention to what happens. So the use of the ashtray to actually create the shape of the smoke. Once I saw it work once, I said, okay, Aaron, you have your other cigar in your hand. You're going to take a big draw on that cigar. You're going to blow smoke into the ashtray. So the cigar itself is actually not really emitting much smoke, if any at all, even though it was ash was burned down to where when you see it. So the smoke is actually just smoke blown into the ashtray so that it curls around. And the exposure here is done, it's like 1/8 of a second so that I can get a little motion of that smoke swirling around. So it's F9 to get that depth. So I get not only the label of the cigar in, but also the glass. And then I'm at ISO 50 to cut out as much ambient as possible in that basement because, as I mentioned, there was 2 small windows, and that's what you
ISO
see reflected
50?
in the glass. Yeah.
50?
50. Yeah.
Okay. See,
So that's
here's what
another
I
thing.
love.
You dial down to the point at which ambient becomes almost non-existent
Right.
in a situation, basement being fairly dark, but there was window light, which is what you see reflected in that glass. I mean, the glass being that shape, you're not going to cut out everything unless you could wrap everything in black.
So here's what I love about this. And this is just the way, as soon as I saw this image in the book, this jumped at me. Let me draw. So that ashtray, the glass, the cigar, the top of the smoke, everything lays out to a very comfortable rule of thirds, but also I'm not going to be able to draw this very well, but also the Fibonacci spiral fits over this too. There's a lot in this image that I absolutely love. Before we get to the real main image, I want to cover this one really quick because this is a second top-down shot that I saw in the book.
Yeah.
And there's something about the way that you do top-down shots that I like. And this one, I partially picked this one because just like you had the pant leg in the other one, you don't just have hands here. Like if you'd shot this straight down, you could have cut the middle of the forearms and had just the hands. But by including the body, it's a size perspective. It's a environmental perspective that I think is critical to this shot.
I'd agree with that. I think I actually had to reduce his stomach a little bit. I remember now that you mentioned that he had a nice big gut. But this was one of those situations where I think the human element is such a big part of the cigar process that we actually learned over time that I think 200 hands touch a cigar from start to finish. Which is, from seed to final package. And that's quite an amazing thing. And it just goes to show you how much the human element is a piece of this world. So in all the pictures, particularly in the factories and fields, I always, focused a lot on hands. I focused a lot on the human element in the environment so that there was some aspect covered that said, in homage to that piece of this process, that you understand that the human part of cigars are what creates cigars. They don't exist without the human. So for sure, by including that, plus that little bit of red, sort of balances this image to me, and it sort of creates a story in itself because there's a lot going on here, obviously. And by being top down, you're flattening things quite a bit. And this is a very unique cigar in that the shape as well as the 2 different colors of leaf, very, very unique Fuente cigar. And, what I've realized over the time of meeting a lot of cigar smokers is most never get to a factory. So it became very important for me to try to represent the farms and the factories to people that might never go there, because I certainly recommend it to anybody because the process is so cool to watch and the repetition of the process is so cool to see. But if they're never able to go do that on their own, then I want those images to provide that service aspect as well, not just art, but also service.
And when you talk about the human aspect, this to me, the classic Ian Spanier shot. Like this to me, I see this shot, I'm like, that's an Ian Spanier shot. This
Thank you.
is the look, the composition, the you know, I can't think of the atmospheric nature of this shot speaks to me. So, and this is an award-winning shot, if I'm not mistaken, correct?
Yeah, I've gotten, I think, 5 different awards for it at this point.
Okay. I just keep thinking about this project as a whole, this idea of a personal project. Looking back at 17 years of this project, 4 books in, 3 of them on this particular subject. And you're not like some major cigar smoker, right? How has this changed you? Like if you were to try and sum up how you have grown as a photographer from doing something outside of your normal commissioned work, how has this changed you?
Well, I guess you sort of answered it in the question. It's growth, going to an image like, the one you just shared, that again, I didn't have that in my arsenal in 2007. Might have lit something exactly the same, but I didn't have this idea in my arsenal. And what I mean by that is this is one of those factories that I kind of previously spoke about. It's just cinder block. There's nothing gorgeous about this factory, in particular this room, which, once that water is on, you can't hear a thing. And how this guy sits there all day with that noise, I have no idea. But the minute we turn that on, there was no talking. It was all just, visually directing and
It's
sort
that
of.
loud?
Yes. Yeah. It's like a steam pipe almost.
Wow.
So, essentially, and there's a BTS of this on my Instagram, but my assistant, Christian Races, who's works with me, since I moved to LA, is fantastic. He is somebody that understands my light. He's one of the few assistants that I will let light something because usually it's me. But he's somebody that knows my style very well. And so this is that same 24-inch umbrella, and he's hand holding the FJ200, which is the smaller strobe, on a light stick, and he is standing on top of the wash basin to the left of me. I'm sitting on the other part of the wash basin, so I'm in between the 2 wash basins. And we had a stand off to camera right with the other FJ200 sort of high and down with an orange gel on it, and this became our theme for this. This was part of some advertising images that I had pitched to General Cigar, which is the company that we were shooting at, to allow me to go in with an assistant and with lights to create images that had something else to them. They weren't just straightforward, because everything I'd shot for them prior to was pretty straightforward. And immediately, Victoria McKee, who was the marketing director at the time, she just got it. Like I'd worked with her for years, but minute I showed the first image, she's like, yes, this is what I could never verbalize that I wanted, but this is what I wanted, which is basically advertising friendly images in a situation where we're not going in and pre-lighting this. We're not, we did 8 of these in one day. This is moving around the factory from space to space and creating depth and feel and emotion to represent what it's like to be part of this, not just the company, but also the process and the high level of quality in a third world nation, which is what it is. So, and this guy, again, I speak, I understand Spanish better than I speak it, but I speak a little bit of Spanish. But he and I just had to vibe, that unspoken language that sort of happens, and I can say a little bit, but not much. But, I think I said something to him like, he looks like, Joey from the Bronx, and I'm from New York, so we're going to get on just good and all that. And, I got a guy translating that, and he is laughing. And, he just became this persona of the cigar worker, which was this proudness and pride in what he does. And this guy's whole job is just washing tobacco leaves. They call these hands of tobacco, and that's his whole job. But you can see in his demeanor and his, pose and all those things, everything I wanted to say about working for this particular company. And, I'm telling Christian, just because we had a iPad off to the side for the marketing director to be able to see the images. I'm looking at back of the camera and I'm just directing Christian with the light. The orange light on the other side, all that was meant to do was to create something more than what was there. And that was it. And,
There's
we
that depth again,
intentionally,
though.
exactly, it's all about that depth. And we intentionally placed the other hands on the table like this, all done very quickly. If you watch the Instagram reel, it's, time lapse. So it's very quick, but it goes to show you what goes into an image like this. In some situations, I mean, I would love to go and pre-light an entire factory and go through each of these different departments and shoot this stuff pre-lit and ready to go. But this was not the assignment. The assignment was 8 shots one day. Let's get this done. And that required us to be mobile. It required us to be fast thinkers, all that stuff.
Were you coaching him, his arm positions, what he was doing?
Yeah. So, okay. Again, the little bit of Spanish that I speak, I'm able to, say, look in this direction. If I want them to smile, if I want them to move their hand, if I want them to, something I talk about quite often is that, naturally we look at hands and eyes in pictures. So I want hands that have a tranquil, tranquilo is how you say it in Spanish. So I'm always saying, tranquilo, tranquilo with the hands, because las manos tranquilo, so that I want those hands to be calm, because if he's got a claw, that creates tension in the image, and I don't want that. So just by that sort of somewhere in between, and it's tough to do, because the minute you talk to somebody about their hands, they usually do this, or it's like they have lobster hands, they just don't know how to move their fingers anymore. It's very strange psychology to it, but it's certainly very important. And one of the tricks, putting one into his hand, one of the hands of tobacco into his hand, his left hand, and that was to keep that in a natural state and not let it be, what do I do with my hands, kind of thing.
So somebody's thinking about doing a personal project. They go to Ian Spanier and say, what's your one tip for me starting a personal project? What would you tell them?
I never thought about that, quite honestly.
My job is done here.
Yeah, you stumped me. I think it starts with a concept. If I was to think about all the variety of personal work that I've done, it's not usually coming from a place of passion. It's usually coming from a place of interest and trying to learn something about something that I don't know something about. So cigars, started with an assignment, but obviously it grew from there. The motorcycle project I did, portraits of motorcycle riders based on their motorcycle, but not the motorcycle. It was the rider, but I would choose the rider based on the motorcycle. I didn't know anything about motorcycles at the time. I now ride a motorcycle. I always wanted to, but I just never did it. I always made an excuse not to do it. After I finished the project, I started riding a motorcycle. Right Next Door, which was my project on interesting people that live all around you, have you no idea what their story is. I use that as a vehicle to have conversations with people that I didn't know what their story was, but more so to teach myself how to shoot video. So, there's a practicality to some of the choices that I make in that sense. Thinking back to like my early days, when I shot a lot of still life, inspiration came from, obviously Irving Penn, crushed items I'd find on the street. I have some Budweiser cans that I still love these pictures of. They're just crushed Budweiser cans I found somewhere. I think I have a can that had some bullet holes in it that I found in Montana, just driving on the road somewhere, that I did some still lifes of. So it's just really, probably maybe the answer is, now that I think about it, what's interesting to you, and what can you do to create imagery of that's going to interest somebody else.
So the book's not technically for sale yet, right? It's for pre-order?
It's pre-order right now, so sales are happening. So yes, you
Okay.
can purchase it now. The printing is happening as we speak, and I just saw pages last week actually, to for color proofs, and the book will be out, I think, first week of February.
Okay, and I just put it on screen if you're watching on YouTube or if you're watching the video version of the podcast. Sigculture.com is where people can find the book. Head on over there, get yourself a pre-order done on this book. Let's switch gears here really quick.
Sure.
Speed round. You've
By
done
the
this
way, I
book?
should mention as well
Yeah.
that, sorry to interrupt, we will be doing a lot of book signings for this. With it,
Oh,
we thankfully we have a you know agenda to make appearances with this book, which I'm thrilled about. So we are already in talks with some locations in New York and Connecticut area, and then there's a cigar shop out here in LA that I've already spoken with. So I imagine there will be potentially London, maybe Australia. I don't know. Going to Australia twice in the span of a year, that would be pretty cool. But certainly there will be other locations as well. It'll all be up on sigculture.com. And obviously I'll be promoting that same stuff on Instagram as well.
okay. Sigculture.com. And that's where they can buy the book and find out all the information of the book.
Absolutely.
And again, we'll give out your links and your website and your Instagram so people can go see stuff there too, coming up in a second. Quick switch gears. You've done this before. I tried to mix it up and get you some different questions.
Okay.
Speed round question and answer. Whatever first pops into your head, that's the answer.
Okay.
Number one, what makes a great photo great?
It's in the eye of the beholder.
Why don't you use a color checker?
I know my range that I typically land within. So I pretty much know the color temperatures that I will be living within. When digital first came out, I did use a color checker. There was a guy at the camera rental place that had invented one that I thought was fantastic. And every single shoot, I used it. And then I got to a place where I was always sort of landing in the same, zone in Kelvin that I didn't need it. And then now at this point, it's either if I manipulate it in camera or on these, fantastic LEDs that you can just go ahead and dial it up, dial it down. I can control my color space there as well, or even on my phone because now the Westcott app allows you to control all these lights on Bluetooth.
You always use a light meter. Why?
You're not a photographer, you don't understand light, and I got into a slight argument with somebody after a YouTube post of I don't even know where this guy was coming from, but quite honestly, he was trying to argue that it was overcomplicating it by using a light meter. Whereas I can promise you, and I've gotten the response from some of my class attendees when I've done appearances, particularly one lecture that I do called "Why You Need a Light Meter," that it will save you time. And
wait,
so,
you have an entire presentation called "Why You Need a Light Meter"?
Absolutely, I've done it many times. Yes, and I had a very, very interesting woman in Hawaii who she's probably in her 60s. Interesting story in that she's a Olympic champion. I don't know, I really remember what she's an Olympic champion in, but she's retired, and she takes pictures out in Hawaii, hard life, right? And she was complaining. Oh, I have a light meter, but it's so much to take it out and this and that and whatever. In one class, I explained exactly why it will save her time in the long run. I get back to Los Angeles, a week passes, and I get a message from her on Instagram to which she says, I just did a shoot. I finally said, I'm going to follow Ian's advice and try this light meter. She said her second frame was on point, exposure was right there. She saved herself 10 to 15 minutes that she usually be fumbling around, turning her lights up or down to get to the exposure that she was only judging on the back of her camera, which, to me is like the, knock in the head thing. And she said, it saved me so much time. And my client was so impressed that I was able to get the exposure in 2 frames. And then we did our shoot. I saved so much time, and time is money. I just made more money because I spent less time on the shoot. Blah, 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 blah. All the reasons I give for why it's so important, because it only puts you there. That's it. And I always say, and I say this very much so in this lecture as well as other places as well, as much as a numbers guy as I am, and much as a technical guy as I am when it comes to lighting, feel always trumps numbers. So if I read f8, but quite honestly, it looks better at f5.6, I'm going to make it 5.6 because it feels better. So light should have a feel always, always, always. So numbers just put you in the right place, and then you make your creative decisions from there.
I love that. Favorite drink?
Well, I would probably say Arnold Palmer.
Okay. Favorite band or singer?
Oh, Bruce Springsteen. We've done this before.
Yeah, we've done this many times before. So, okay, last question.
Yeah.
And again, you've done this before. Try and pick somebody you haven't picked before. But if you were to tell somebody one photographer that if they're not following them or don't know about them, they should be familiar with, who would it be?
Well, we did say Harry Benson last time, and I gave the reasons for that. But I would 100,000% say Albert Watson. By far my favorite contemporary photographer. A close second would be Andy Anderson. Just an amazing, amazing photographer. Former military guy, lives in Idaho, made a career out of Idaho, of all places, which always astounded me, particularly in the late 90s, early 2000s when I was assigning photography, and watching him somehow have a career from Idaho, which just seems impossible to me. But he's managed to do it, and he is just, he's a master. Absolutely, hands down, one of my favorite photographers.
I will make sure to get links to their websites from you. If you could email those to me, I'll make sure that those are in the blog post and in the description on YouTube, folks, so that you can find those links. And we need to get your links out there as well. I've been putting them on screen as we go through. So if you're watching the video, you'll see that on YouTube or in the video version of the podcast. If you're listening to the audio only version of the podcast, Ian, where can people find you? Run down your website, your socials, all that type of stuff.
Sure thing. So website is ianspanier.com. That's the easy one. The Instagram, which is where I spend most of my time, is at Ian Spanier. I am on Facebook, Ian Spanier Photo, and I'm also on Twitter and, sorry, not Twitter. I stopped doing Twitter. TikTok at Ian Spanier, LinkedIn at Ian Spanier Photo, I believe. And quite honestly, if you want to reach me, it's Instagram. That's where I spend most of my time. As you mentioned, I am an affiliate for Westcott as well as a number of other products. I'm always happy to share those discount codes. So feel free to DM me if you do see some products that I'm using and you want to check them out for yourself.
I have a page of discount codes that I don't push very often that's on my website. So if you're looking for discount codes on Platypod or Kelby One or lensrentals.com, stuff like that, I've got those discounts. Hit Ian up if you want a Westcott discount. And I've got all kinds of people that have discounts, like ProGrade Digital. David Bergman's got discounts. I wish I had more of those on my site. I wish more companies would give me discounts. And by the way, the discounts that I have on my site, they're not affiliate links. I don't do any affiliate links. I don't make anything on any of these links. It's just companies that I know and I've used and I've reached out to saying, hey, I'd love to offer my viewers or listeners a discount if at all possible. Ian, as always, my friend, it is great to see you. Thank you for doing this again. I appreciate it.
No, thank you. I mean, honestly, it's so hard to promote these personal projects. So I really appreciate you being open to talking about it and putting it out there for the world. Cigars is definitely a niche world. So it presents its challenge. I always find it funny that, Aaron has a pretty good following on cigars in his Instagram. And if I post stuff about cigars, it doesn't get much of a reaction, but he does. And I'm always just like, that's so strange. But I think I just don't really hit that cigar world so much. This book has been changing it. I have noticed a little uptick on cigar smokers, and shops are starting to follow me, which is interesting in itself. Because again, they're going to ask me, what's your favorite cigar? And I'm going to be like, couldn't tell you. So it's just one of those things.
Well, again, sigculture.com is the book. Pre-order now, comes out, what'd you say, February?
Should be out February. And as I mentioned, we will be updating regularly once we start getting these book signing locations and dates out there.
Again, I appreciate you coming on here and doing this so much. Go get yourself a book. I love the personal project aspect of this, though, because I've said to myself for years, I need to do more personal project stuff. If you want to find all the links or anything I wrote about Ian, behindtheshot.tv, not .com. If you want to follow me, it's at Steve Brazill. Almost anywhere that you go, Mastodon, X/Twitter, Blue Sky. I've stopped. I don't really use Facebook. But if for some reason you want to find me on Facebook, I'm there. It's Steve Brazill Photography there. Behindtheshot.tv is there as well. Basically, anywhere you can find me, you can pretty much find me. If you are watching on YouTube, keep in mind, I approach this show in two ways. Mainly, I approach it as a podcast. First and foremost, it is designed for people in a podcast application. If your podcast application of choice, Apple Podcasts, for example, supports video, you can get a video version of the show, or you can get an audio-only version of the show, two separate feeds when you search for Behind the Shot, wherever you get your podcast. Places like Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube Music, for Google Podcast, stuff like that. There's only the audio version, but a lot of places do support video. If yours does not, head on over to YouTube. Find my channel there, which is Behind the Shot. Makes it real easy. Hit subscribe, hit like, make sure you check the notifications so that you get any notification when I release a new show. I just released one with Jen on backstage portraits at concerts, which was good. Jen Devereaux. Love that one. Just released it the day I'm actually recording this one. This will probably come out 2 weeks from the day that we're recording it. But again, as always, wherever you get it, if you would drop a 5-star, if you would, drop a written review, it would be very, very much appreciated. I'm Steve Brazill. Thanks as always for joining me. Make sure you join me next time as we try and get inside the mind of a great photographer by taking a closer look behind the shot.